Good morning. We're in Hemshech Samach Vav, page 8. We're continuing on page 8. We finished the paragraph where essentially he discussed in the last two pages, page 7 and 8, the paragraph that began on page 7, explaining that the reason given in Eitz Chaim, Legalis Shlemus Kechesov, that creation was revealed, the capacity, the abilities, the powers, the potential. The exact words are, She's Galuk Shlemus Kechesov, the complete, the perfect powers, Upulesov, Shmesov, Kinuyov, cannot be the ultimate purpose because God's potential, so to speak, or his capacity does not lack the actual. In the words that he used, Ein Kayach Chaser Payil. So what purpose would this serve? Ultimately, since Hashem is Shlemus, is complete as it is, what does this accomplish? This doesn't mean it's not achieved through creation. It absolutely is achieved, and it has a role to play. But you can't say what he calls tachlisa, amitis. That's the word he used. Amitis tam. Tachlis kavana amitis. And we'll get back to what is the tachlis kavana amitis and what role this plays. In the process of discussing that, the Rebbe Rashab dissected what exactly means shleimus kechesav. And he went through the different levels. He said in the level of mamala kalaman, it applies. That is mamala kalaman. That's the idea of revealing the divine energy and embedding it within existence. But it's not the amshach of seviv kalaman, into mamala kalaman, as he discussed. And then he went through several levels, what we call alei sarotzen, or Atzilus the klolis esespheres agnuzis, which includes the esis sarishimu before the tzimtzum, which he also called shir atzmei b'keyach. So there's a desire within the divine consciousness pre-tzimtzum. You'll still need a tzimtzum because the energy is still too intense, but it's all within the divine consciousness. In Metziyus nimtza, you have this level, but this level has already esespheres agnuzis. It's not lacking anything. Prior to that is Kedem alei sarotzen, what he called l'maylam alei sarotzen, pre-desire, if you wish, or pre-conscious desire. But there too, he explained, at least on a subtle level, there's something there, and that's what the Zohar, and we'll get to the Zohar in a minute. And then there's Atzmus, built in Metziyus Nimtza, where altogether you don't talk about Koyach and Poil, completely beyond. The last piece we learned that the Zohar, in the beginning of Zohar, where it says, Bereishu Menisa de Malka, when arose in God's desire or permission of the king, the will for existence, Golav Galif B'Tir Elah, something was inscribed or engraved, an engraving, in the level called Tehir Elah, which he doesn't discuss here. There's many different explanations for this, as I said, but he gives two interpretations in this, that it means Alei Saratzen, that means Bereshum Nusa de Malka, and you see right away, Golav Galifu, something happens. There's some inscription, there's some etching going on within the divine consciousness. And that is the Rishima, he says. Then there's an interpretation, Beresh Ramanusa de Malka refers to Lamaila Mebchinas Kisha Allah B'Ritzei, higher than Allah B'Ritzei, like thought, he gave the example. And Yesh Lemer, he says that that's the letters of the Rishimu that are even higher than in the conscious desire, that there's already something there even prior to the actual conscious desire. The bottom line is, Nimtza Muv Mahanal, that was the end of the paragraph. From all of this, what we take away is Lamaila, the Koyach is not lacking Poil. Meaning, even in these levels before the Tzimtzum, it's not like it's lacking something that God needs to express it after the Tzimtzum. There has to be a different reason, the ultimate reason for creation. So you can't say this is the true reason for creation, because he was complete even before creation. Okay. We did touch upon, which I'm going to talk about later more at length, question was asked about time. So I always qualify, as you notice, that this is all conceptual time. There's no actual time going on here. These levels that we're describing here are happening right now. But can you say that they were always there? So that gets into another discussion. Was time always there? And the answer is no. Time is a creation. Time begins somewhere. Whether it begins after the Tzimtzum, or God conceives of time before the Tzimtzum, the concept of time. But regardless, once we don't talk about time, you can't talk about before, present, and after. You can't talk about past, present, and future. So this is a discussion of its own. I don't want to go into it right here. And of course, the question that was asked was, so when God arose in his will, as soon as you say it arose in his will, that sounds like there was a time that it didn't arise in his will. So we don't call it time, we call it levels. That in the divine, there's levels. There's the way God relates to time and relates to existence as he begins to envision it, and the way the divine is beyond existence. So for all practical purposes, that's how you should think about it. Think of it as two ways of God relating or not relating. So you talk about time, you're already talking about an existence that relates to the present, past, and future that we relate to. And then in time itself, there's also spiritual time and physical time. But I don't want to go into more detail. It is important to talk about. There will be a Maimer in Samach Vav a little later, Vayichulu, that will discuss it. And we'll review it then. And as we go on, I'm sure this will come up more than once. With that said, that's a summary of what we learned. Now we're ready to go to the next paragraph. I gave a short introduction yesterday of this paragraph, that he's now going back to the Zohar, begin the Shtamidin Bey, lay. It's two, in the Zohar it says lay. In the Maimorim sometimes it says Bey. They remark about it in the footnotes, I believe. Yeah. In order for him to be known. And the Eitz Chaim says, it's an explanation in the Zohar, when you say to reveal his faculties, is basically an explanation of that him to be known. So the Rebbe Rashab is now going to address that very expression and explain similarly that you can't say that's the ultimate purpose either. Why? Because why does God have to be known? And more importantly, or equally importantly, we're going to learn God is known even in the higher worlds. You don't need to create the lowest of worlds for him to be known, which is also regarding Shleimus Kechesav, even though he didn't say it. So in other words, there's going to be two reasons why ultimately you can't say these two, the Zohar and the Eitz Chaim are the ultimate reason. One is God is complete without that expression, without that revelation, without him being known. And two, you don't need the lowest of worlds for that. Atzilus also knows God. And if it's with the Galish Shleimus Kechesav, in Atzilus, you already can see God's strength, God's capacity being revealed. So though he didn't mention that, but that's going to be a second reason that we have to say there's a different reason for creation. Till now, he hasn't actually even talked about Tachtenim, except in the beginning. So we're going to get back to that. But right now, the focus in the next page, or let's put it this way, starting from this paragraph, we'll see how far it goes, is going to be on the Zohar. So with that, we'll start the new paragraph. So middle of page 8, lower part of page 8, 2/3 down the page. Again, if you want to follow the text and you don't have the book, just go to samachvav.com. You have all the PDF scanned pages of this discourse, as well as it's also posted on our WhatsApp group. Okay. Ukamoy Kain, Rebbe Rashab continues now. And similarly, or so too, is it with the so too what? Just as we just discussed the Eitz Chaim, Legalish Shleimus Kechesav, the revealing of his complete and perfect faculties, so too regarding the Zohar, where the Zohar says, begin the Yishtamudin lay. Yishtamudin from the word deya in Aramaic, begin, in order for him to be known. Begin is like because, biglal. Bichdei, actually. Bichdei, Yishtamudin lay. So too regarding that, Also, regarding that, we could also say that's not the ultimate purpose. Why? This idea that he's talking about, perceiving godliness, understanding God, dishtamudin, and hasoga, and comprehending in Erein Sof Baruch Hu be'elam esel yenim. The real place, the primary place where you really understand God most is in the spiritual higher worlds, not in the lower worlds. Because as the energy gets more diminished, we also become less aware. So it's the elam esel yenim. Elam Atzilus, Ulamaylam Atzilus. Like in the world of Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. There you don't have the impediments. Maybe that's not the right word. You don't have the concealments, the partitions, and all the filters that exist in Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. In Atzilus, Ulamaylam Atzilus. Shasham Meir Gili Erein Sof Baruch Hu. There, Erein Sof Baruch Hu, the divine consciousness, radiates. It's not like before the Tzimtzum. But in the context of Seder Ishtashlus, if someone were to say, where's the best place to go to get to know God, you'd say, go to the higher worlds. Like when we say, go to Gan Eden. Gan Eden is even lower than Atzilus. But here's saying Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. That's where you get the deepest and the best understanding of godliness. V'hainu, what does that mean? He now breaks it down further. Why is it the case? Because you have there the Gili Hakav, Shemer Be'elam Ein Sof Shalifnei Atzilus. Because there you have you're closer and more access to the Kav. Remember, the Kav is like the artery. We can call it the main artery that brings divine consciousness into Seder Shtashlus after the Tzimtzum. So the higher you go up the Kav, the more awareness you have. And the more yishtamudin you have, the more deya. But let me just explain the words, what he says here. Elamis ha'ein sof shalifnei atzilus. Okay. Little explanation. Again, this is, the Rebbe Rashab is going right into the thick of things and expecting that we already know many of these concepts, but I'll explain what he's referring to here. Till now, we've been talking a lot about lifnei tzimtzum. Lifnei tzimtzum, as I always point out, really spoils us in a way. Because once you talk about it, you feel like, oh, I'm there. But the truth is, the lifnei tzimtzum is so powerful that we can, not only can't we envision it, we can't even exist in its presence. That's why there's a tzimtzum in the first place. And yet, God is giving us a glimpse into the so-called engine room, as I've mentioned many times. After the tzimtzum, why did you need the tzimtzum? Because that was so intense. So after the tzimtzum, we have a complete space, empty space. That's what the tzimtzum creates. There's a rishimu, yes, but the rishimu is also concealed, like we discussed, the letters. Then comes the kav. Now, as much as the kav is just a thin ray, and we keep saying kav v'chut, it's only a line, it's a thread, a laser beam. You have to remember, it's coming from Erein Sof before the tzimtzum. And it's light. It's not kalim. It's not concealment. The light has been now channeled and is being focused and is being harnessed and directed, but it's still tremendously intense. So if you were to think of, let's say, the sunlight. So sun, when you look at the sun directly in full glory, it can blind you, God forbid. So you need to wear some type of shades, or the sun has to be covered up to some extent. But even if you were to cover up some of the sun, but the sunlight directly would come to you, look at a solar eclipse, where the whole sun is covered, but you know what? It could be more damaging to the cornea because you're getting the very essence of the light. I'm not comparing that to the Kav. My point is, just because something follows a tzimtzum doesn't mean it isn't intense. So the Kav is extremely intense. That's why there are no worlds yet. The Kav will begin, like I said, the main artery, I called it the stylus, you could say God's paintbrush, however you define it, of light, will begin to shape existence. The way the Eitz Chaim puts it, first it creates a circle. That's the igulim, the first eagle of Ak. Then comes another eagle, and another eagle. And the Kav slowly, again, conceptually, makes its way downward as it shapes existence. So after the Tzimtzum, we know about many worlds. Generally speaking, we talk about 4 worlds: Atzilus, Biy, Yesh, and Asiya. But we also know, we've heard of the world called Adam Kadmon. The first of all worlds is called Adam Kadmon. Then there's a world called Akudim. Elam Akudim, 10 energies in 1 container. Elam Akudim, 10 energies in 10 containers, otherwise known as Toyu. Then comes Atzilus, the Protis, in microcosm, Tikkun, or Vrudim. Then comes Biy, Yesh, Asiya following that. Overall, we talk about 4. And there's different ways it's structured. But generally speaking, when you speak about Atzilus, Biy, Yesh, and Asiya, and someone will say, what's before Atzilus? So Chassidus explains, generally before Atzilus, we call it Eilemis Ein Sof La'achar Tzimtzum. We're not talking about Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, where there's no Eilemis altogether. After the Tzimtzum itself, everything higher than Atzilus in generally categories called Eilemis Ein Sof, because relative to Atzilus, which is a structured world, a divine world, everything is divine there. Like the Aves, the patriarchs, they were 24/7 aligned with God. They were channels and chariot, a vehicle for godliness in this world. But higher than Atzilus is called Eilemis Ein Sof. One of the reasons is because it's not really structured yet. Even though you have 10 energies in 1 container, or you have energy in Eris in general, the Kalim have not yet been shaped in a full sense like an Atzilus. So we call it Eilemis Ein Sof. So right now he's referring to Atzilus and Lamaylam Atzilus. So he said, if you want to really have awareness of the divine, you go into as close as you can to the Kav, because the Kav is carrying the divine instructions and is the closest thing to Ein Sof. It is actually Ein Sof within a Kav. So that's what he's saying. Sheshamer Gilei Ein Sof, Hainu Gilei HaKav Shemer be'Eilemis Ein Sof Shalifnei Atzilus. So the Kav radiates in the Eilemis Ein Sof before Atzilus, v'gam be'Eilam Atzilus. Obviously, on a lower level, also not Atzilus. That's why those worlds are purely divine. There is no other agenda going on. They are worlds, meaning they have structure. There's Chochmah, Bina, Das in Atzilus, we know, all the way to Malchus of Atzilus, but it's completely saturated and imbued and permeated with the Ir HaKav. That's the way we define Atzilus. The dynamics of Atzilus, if you want, the makeup of Atzilus is that the Kav radiates there, and thus that's the place. If you want to get to know God most, that's the place you would go to. That's what he says. Ikar Yediyah v'Hasaga. V'yedim u'masigim b'chinas Mehus alakus mamish. And on that level, they perceive or know and comprehend not just the Metziyus of Elikus, not just that existence of godliness, but the Mehus. Remember the difference between Mehus and Metziyus? Metziyus means you know it exists. Mehus is Mahu. The word Mehus comes from what is it? Not just that it exists, you know what it's made of. So it's an intimate knowledge. So many things we know of. We can know that a God exists, but we know nothing about God, or very little. In Atzilus and higher than Atzilus, you know the Mehus of Elikus, because you're right in touch with this main artery. You can call it the Kav. Mehus Elikus Mamish. Ava Be'elam is Biyah. But when you go lower than Atzilus, the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, Hari Ha'er Muster V'Nelam. This very divine light is now covered and concealed. She'ena Meir B'Gili. Doesn't radiate in a revealed way. V'chol ha'yediyah v'hasaga, and all the perception or knowledge and comprehension, gam be'elam is biyah haruchnim, or even in the spiritual worlds of biyah, the spiritual b'riyah tzir asiyah. Not even talking about the physical yes asiyah, who b'chinas hametziyas delikus. It's all in knowing the existence of godliness, not the Mehus, not the personality, the existence. You can meet someone and you see they exist. You clearly know that they exist. But what do you know about their personality? We talked about the artist. You can look at art and you can somewhat extrapolate what the artist is like, but not much. Imagine you meet the artist, or you know the artist, or you meet someone who knows the artist. They will tell you about their personality. Just as an example. So in Biyah, Yes, you know, but all its whole idea and asog is in the Metziyus of Elikus. Loy bebchinas Mehus mamish, not mamish in the Mehus. Why does it say mamish? Because obviously some Metziyus gives you some insight into the personality, but it's not mamish the personality as if you really know someone close up in depth and so on. Furthermore, it's not just that's how Biyah exists. The very creation of Biyah is predicated on this fact. Visavusam hu be'efen zedavke. The creation of Biyah, for them to serve their purpose, Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, they cannot be like Atzilus. Then there's no Biyah is not meant to be Atzilus. They were created specifically in this way, Shelo Yizgala, that the divine, the personality of the divine should not be revealed. V'lo yirgish b'hem ha'er eliki mamish. That within them should not be revealed and not be sensed or felt the mamish, the er eliki. So they definitely sense godliness, but not mamish in a way like we talked here, the Mehus. Now, why is that the case? Because you need them to become a Yesh. Atzilus, precisely because it's so close to the divine, can never become a Yesh. Because its whole personality is refined, and as I said, it's a pure vehicle for divine expression. Whereas in Biyah, you want a Yesh. And a Yesh is defined by not having such revelation. The more divine revelation there is, the less Yesh a person, the entity could have. So what do you see from this? That the begin dish Talmud, and he's going to spell it out more, that knowing God and being aware of God is actually, the higher you go, the more aware you are. What about Atzilus and higher than Atzilus? How were they created? Remember, he's talking here both the very existence, the personality of these worlds, their identity, but also their form of creation. So by contrast to Biyah, the Elam Atzilus, V'kolshkina Elam Shalamayim Atzilus, the world of Atzilus, and definitely the worlds higher than Atzilus that we discussed, Elam Ein Sof, Eifinis Avusam, their manner of creation, Hu Sheyer Behem Er Begili. That's exactly the opposite. Their creation is exactly that the light should shine in them in a revealed way. Top of page 9. V'yurgish Behem Er, and they should feel and sense that energy. U'mitziyusam lo yeh b'bchinas yesh, and their existence should not be a yesh. A yesh here meaning an independent consciousness. Ki'im b'bchinas elikus, but rather it should be a level of elikus, of godliness, not yesh. U'kumoya kelim da'atzilus shein elikus mamish. That like the containers of Atzilus, they are containers. That means there's a structure. They have identity, but the identity is elikus mamish. Umiyuchadim ba'er, and they're seamlessly connected, united with the er. Like I said, you have the oves can live down in this world. They're human beings, flesh and blood, but their entire being is a vehicle for the divine in this world. We cannot say that about ourselves. We try to be as much as we can through our Torah and mitzvahs. But imagine someone that is just pure channel of godliness, transparent channel. So there is a keli, but the keli is completely united with the ur. The ihu v'garmuhi chad, the expression in Zohar, the Tikkun Zohar should say that ihu, God, the garmui, and this is interpretation of garmui means, garmui often means it can be atzomis, can be like the skeleton of something. But garmui here means the kelim, that he and his kelim are one. I just want to see where I want to stop for a moment. Continues to explain the difference between Atzilus and Biyah. More information. But being that I've read for a while, maybe I'll stop if there are any questions. But he's still in the middle of explaining the difference between Atzilus and Biyah. Be aware of that. And of course, he's building all this up to come to explain that the reason that God should be known, the Zohar, begin the Talmud and Biy, is not an explanation for the lowest of worlds. It's an explanation for the higher worlds, because that's where you know God most. Okay, but let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything. So let's continue. The Klolos is Savas Atzilus. This again is a Samach Vav style. Everything is very elaborate. And you could always refer to here because if you want to know what is Atzilus, here's a good description. He continues to explain about how Atzilus was formed and shaped. And the general bringing into being of the existence of Atzilus, Subabchinas Kiruv. So that means when you do something, you could do something from a distance. You could do something close up. So the Savas of Atzilus is basically, Elikus is very much identifying with Atzilus when it creates it. Shahari Hein Bechinas Gileah Helam. Because Atzilus is Gileah Helam, as it's explained elsewhere. So when we learned Ayin Beis, right in the beginning of Ayin Beis, he actually began with this topic, whether Atzilus is Gileah Helam or Yesh Ma'ayin. So let me explain for a moment what Gileah Helam means. Let's see if I can bring an example first, a human example. We're not creators, but the closest thing to us creation is the creation of a child, the conception of a child. So even though it's not Yesh Ma'ayin Mamish, because it does come from a seed and from an egg, but relatively speaking, it's a pretty miraculous thing that a man and a woman, husband and wife, can conceive a child. It's part of Koyach Ein Sof that Hashem gave the humans the ability to do. But you can't compare that, for example, to a teacher and a student. The teacher does not create the mind of the student. The student was born to parents, has an independent mind. The teacher is revealing to him and helping train and educate him with knowledge, with information. So we call that Gileah Helam, not Yesh Ma'ayin. The birth of a child is an atzmitz, a new entity is born, a human being. Now, spiritually, a teacher can be called a parent, but physically not. So there are things that are called Gileah Helam. Gileah Helam means that it's already there, but it's only being revealed. Yesh Ma'ayin is a bigger leap. So in this context, Atzilus is referred to Gileah Helam, that it originates from higher levels of godliness that were concealed. And you don't call Atzilus, therefore, a Yesh Ma'ayin. That's why you don't call it Bria. We call it Atzilus, which means an emanation. Where does it come from? In the Parsha Ba'aleischa, the first place Atzilus is mentioned is when Moshe said to Hashem, Ma'ayin li basar, where am I going to get meat from? The people want meat. And Hashem told him, V'atzalti min haruach asher alecha, I will impart from the Spirit upon you, upon the Skenim. He told him to gather the 70 sages, and that's what he says, V'atzalti. So Atzilus comes, that it was the Ruach of Moshe, because he's the leader. He didn't delegate it to anyone else. However, from that Spirit was imparted. That's the word Atzilus. Imparted is Gileah Helam, not Yesh Ma'ayin. So in that sense, Atzilus is a revelation of deeper divine levels that were concealed earlier, and now they're becoming revealed in Atzilus. Once you get to Bria, Bria is called Bria, Bora. Bora is Yesh Ma'ayin, the leap. It's a bigger quantum leap. Now, everything comes from God, obviously. And in some ways, even Atzilus, compared to very high levels, is also referred to at times Yesh Ma'ayin. But I don't want to go into that right now. Here, he wants to focus on that Atzilus is a creation b'bchinas kiruv. Yesh and Ayin are very far apart from each other. There's a big leap. Gileah Helam is closer. So he calls that b'chinas Gileah Helam, like explained elsewhere. Again, if you want more, just go to footnote 122. And there gives more sources for this. V'yashleimer, the zeu inyam Atzilus uloshen etzlei v'samach. So another meaning in the word Atzilus, not just impart or emanate, is it comes from the word Eitzel. Eitzel in Hebrew means close. Eitzel v'samach. That's right nearby. So it comes from the word etzlei v'samach, which again is taught from the Pardes and other sources. You can look in the footnotes. That's why it's called Atzilus Samach, because it's b'pchinas kiruv. Something that is like Yesh you wouldn't call close by or nearby. Nearby means it's not far, not physically, obviously, but spiritually, conceptually speaking, Atzilus is not distant from the levels before Atzilus. Hainu d'Atzilus ha'esses sfiras, Hainu d'Atzilus ha'esses sfiras d'Atzilus hu b'pchinas kiruv. That the imparting or the emanation of the 10 spheres of Atzilus is in the form of kiruv, etzle v'samach. So you say Atzilus is close and nearby. What? Elikus. Umeshum zeh, and due to that fact, klolos ha'esses spheres d'Atzilus b'pchinas eres v'kelim, the general 10 spheres of Atzilus, which are made and comprised of energies and containers, harihem dvukim, they are bound or cleave or attached, umiyichodim and united, be'er ein sof ha'maitzil, in the infinite divine ein sof of the emanator. So Atzilus is the product of the maitzil of the emanator. And there's a closeness between them, there's something in common between them, basically. So in Atzilus, therefore, you get the best taste of what Elikus is like, because it's not coming with a leap. It's essentially as close as it gets, or no, close as it gets, but close to the divine. The iyu v'chayu. Now he brings the whole statement in the Tikkun Ezer, because God is one. Iyu is one with chayu, with the energies, the oir. Iyu v'gamu echad, and he's one with the kelim. That's Atzilus. But now back to Biyah. Aval Elam is Biyah. By contrast, the lower worlds of Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, Eifinis Avusam, Hu Aidei Hester Vehelam, Habeira Manivra. Their manner of creation is through covering and concealment of the creator from the creation, or the creator, or the creature. See, here's now using Boira Nivra, before he used Maitzil Netzal, emanator and emanation. Here he's using creator and creation, in a manner that the Mehus, the personality of the divine energy, should not be radiate and be felt within them. Not completely not, but not in the way that we're just talking about Atzilus, the Mehus of it. So the Metziyus, yes, but not the Mehus. Let me stop again. This covers Atzilus and Biy, but he's going to qualify this because the fact of the matter, Biy is still a pretty spiritual world, and it has a high level. So he's going to explain what about the fact that we do know that in Biy there's levels of divine revelation. We know Biy is Gan Eden Elyon, Gan Eden Tachten, the Malachim. Biy is a very high level. So he's going to qualify and explain what that means in the context of what we're learning. But I'll stop here again for any questions about what we've learned till here, if there are any.
In the human experience, the four olamos, so you would say that Atzilus is the subconscious, and the...
No, that's all relative. You could say Keser is subconscious and Atzilus is conscious. If you talk about Atzilus compared to Biy, you can call it what I would call superconscious, better than sub. But yeah, relatively speaking, it's all relative. I wouldn't say it's definitive, because Atzilus is a conscious, existent world. But relative to Biy, like anything that way, conscious and superconscious, always know is always relative. Meaning, compared to a lower level, the higher level is superconscious. So Bria, you could say superconscious compared to Yetzirah, technically. Usually don't use that term there, but hypothetically, you could speak that way.
Thank you.
When you're saying Keser, it's not part of Atzilus? Keser de Atzilus.
He's not talking about Keser here. It's a whole, Keser is its own parsha b'fnei atzmei. Keser is higher than Atzilus, but it's Keser of Atzilus. You ask me where Keser is in this context? In Torah, the Alter Rebbe says everything before Atzilus is the level of Keser. So sometimes Keser is the Elam Ein Sof that he referred to. If that's what you're asking. Sometimes it's referred to that. But it all depends. Sometimes Keser is spoken about more as it relates to Atzilus. Sometimes Keser is spoken about as it relates to higher than Keser. Like let's say Atik and Arich. Arich is Reishan Etzolim, and Atik is Tachteina Shebemaitzel. So if you start talking Keser, it's this whole entity of its own, and it has a component of Atzilus and higher than. But generally, I wouldn't bring Keser into this, it'll just confuse matters. We're talking general Atzilus. Obviously, higher than Atzilus includes Keser, and there's even more Yediyah in Elikus. Yeah.
Another thing that our world, the Siyah Gashmi, is not even on the level of Biyah, correct? Because in our world, it's
Not in the
even
level of
Yediyah Metziyus.
not in the level of Biyah Ruchnim, but it's the end of Asiyah Ruchnius will evolve into Asiyah Gashmius and then Asiyah Chumrius. So yes,
Right.
Elam Hazeh Agashmi is the lowest of all the four worlds, and it's the physical dimension of the lowest of them. Yeah.
In the sense that you don't feel there is not even a Yediyah Sametzius. You don't feel that it is a Yediyah.
That's what he says, and Tanya, he's going to soon talk about it. We're going to talk about it from Tanya Perik Lamed Vav. Correct.
What's the difference between the world of Gashmis and the world of Chumrius?
We'll talk about that when we get there. Right now, we're talking about Atzilus and Biy, so let's be patient. We'll get there soon. Okay. So now he says like this. But after everything we just said about Atzilus and Biy, which is clear, V'agam, the Eira Neshama de Biy, hu b'chinas alakus de kelim da Atzilus. So as always, things get complicated. It says in Kabbalah that the Eir HaNeshama of Biy. So let me explain what that means. Eve. Remember, in every world and every dimension, there's 5 dimensions: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. So the Neshama, the Eir HaNeshama of Biy has Nefesh, it has Ruach, which generally would be like Nehi, would be Nefesh. Ruach would be Chagas, the Midas. And Neshama is usually the Moichin. Chai Yechid is already the 2 levels within Keser, Arich and Atik. But the Eir HaNeshama Biy, the Kabbalah says, comes from the Kalim, from the godliness of the Kalim of Atzilus. If you look in footnote 124, is the source. There he quotes the Geras HaKedesh. Let's just see, 124. Yeah. Kiyadua. And in 125 is the sources in Kabbalah, in Eitz Chaim. So that's a statement. So in other words, the leap from Atzilus to Biy is not just a absolute one leap, and Biy is on its own. It also goes in gradations. Remember, Seder Ishtalshelus is the reason it's called Ishtalshelus. Ishtalshelus is like a shalshelis, a chain. If you look at a chain, there are no leaps. Every link of every link of the chain is linked to the previous link, like this. And it goes. Yes, the top link and the bottom link are far apart, but they're all one link. They're all one shalshelis, one shtalshelus. So if you think of it that way, when Atzilus now gets diminished through the parsa that we've learned about, the partition and the filters into Biy, it's not just a jump. The kalim of Atzilus, not the Eiris, but the kalim of Atzilus, have elikus in them, like we just discussed. Not quite the same level of Eir of Atzilus, but it's still elikus. That will manifest in the Eir HaNeshama of Biy. And then that will continue its journey into Ruach, into Nefesh, into the lower levels of Biy. So what do you see from this? That Biy is not completely separate. In that sense, Biy should have a taste of Atzilus. And we just said Atzilus has a Yediyas HaMehus. So it's true, of course, we're not trying to suggest that Biy is like Atzilus, but the Rebbe Rashab wants to qualify and explain that there is Yediyah there, but he's going to explain the difference. Even though this oir is being transmitted from the kelim of Atzilus, sometimes you'll learn is the 30 kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. So in case you come across it, you'll know it's the same idea. It's the 30 kelim of Malchus of Atzilus that then draw into Neshama Biyah. But here's the qualification. Nevertheless, in the kelim of Biyah, you don't feel the Mehus of the Oir at all. Ukamaymer hatikunim, and he brings a proof from it from Tikkun Zeir. Like it says in Tikkun Zeir, the same Tikkun Zeir we talked about, Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'gamu ichad, the be'elam abriya lav Iyu v'chayu v'gamu ichad. That in Bria it's explicitly not one. The Eiris and the Kelim of Biyah are not one with Ihu, like it is in Atzilus. And that's why, due to that fact, that's why in Biyah, even the higher levels of Biyah, they become a Yesh and a Metziyus of their own, not completely, seamlessly a vehicle to the divine, to Eirei Ein like in Atzilus. So what is the Eirei Neshama then about? There is in Biyah an element of that. But firstly, like he said here, it's behind the scenes. So you can access it through Avodah. But on its own, Biyah is Yesh and Metziyus. Even regarding this Eirei Neshama. He doesn't go into much explanation what his purpose is, but you can imagine, like in the Shtalshlus, again, it's all about stepping stones. The fact that in Biyah we have Eirei Neshama that comes from the Kelim of Atzilus means that through our Avodah, we can climb from Biyah into Atzilus. But not initially. On its own, Atzilus is Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'gamu ichad, a complete vehicle to godliness. Biyah is not. Biyah is not Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'gamu ichad, as he just said. And that's why it's a Yesh Metziyus. Now again, this has been talking before Avodah. Avodah changes everything. Because the whole purpose of Avodah is to make a dira b'tachtenim, that even the lowest worlds we connect. Here he's talking about how it is at the outset of creation. The difference between the higher worlds, Atzilus, and then Biyah, as he's explaining right here. Any questions on this little piece we just read? Now he's going to go to Elam is Biyah itself. Okay, now that we've established this, so he's literally going through higher than Atzilus, now Biyah, the Neshama Biyah, now Biyah itself, in the context of awareness and consciousness of Elikus. So now he says, Ube'elam is Biyah Gufa, in the worlds of Biyah itself, there's also a hierarchy and gradations and levels. Hine'elam is Elyenim Haruchnim, the higher worlds in Biyah, the spiritual higher worlds. The way they're created is that they should feel. And he says now in Yiddish, Ezol der Hedven. You have to know Yiddish to understand what he's adding here, but it's a very personal, intimate expression. Ezol der Hedven, it should be sensed. Is the best way I can translate it. Al kaponim b'chinas ha-metzias delikus. Mehus of Elikus, we've established already the personality of the artist, of the God, of godliness. That is primarily in Atzilus. Biyah is the Metziyus. But in the higher worlds, they're created in a way, at least you should feel the Metziyus of Elikus, the existence of Elikus. And now he has that mamish word. I pointed out many times when we learned Ayin Beis, especially by the Rebbe Rashab. He'll say something is yesh, and then he'll say yesh mamish. Mehus mamish. Because remember, language is very limited when you're talking about these abstract and sublime levels. So mamish comes to tell us that it's totally. Not mamish means it's not completely, but something yes. So when you say not yesh mamish, saying it is a yesh, in Atzilus you can't say yesh altogether. It's bottle, the bittel. Here's a yes, but it's not a yesh mamish. Now, it's not difficult to explain the relative levels of a yesh. We can see it from ourselves. There are times you're in a more yesh state, a little more sense of self, and sometimes you're a little more selfless. Even when you're selfless, you can't say you're completely not a yesh. So there are levels in yeshes. So Bria and the higher levels that he's talking now, the Reil Mesruchnim of Biyah, there, at least they feel the Metziyus of Elikus, and it's not Mamish a Yesh. So there is an entity that's separate from the divine, but it's a very refined Yesh, you can call it. And that's my words. He doesn't use those words here. It's one way to explain it. The Einam B'chin is Pirud Mamish, and that Mamish is separate. They're not one like a vehicle, like the Merkava of Atzilus, but you can't call them totally separate either. Like a malach, for example, a malach is usually not in Atzilus, it's in Biy, but a malach is dedicated to what God sends. It's a shliach. So a shliach, you're not going to say he's pirud. He's not separate. He's a shluchis shel adam. And some ways kamoisei. However, he is a separate entity, but it's a separate entity that is doing the bidding of the mishaleach. Whereas Atzilus, it's a complete seamless vehicle. So these are basically levels of bittul. So we're talking here the higher levels. It's not a yesh mamish, and you can't call it pirud mamish. Pirud mamish would be you're completely separate and doing things that are antithetical to what God wants.
But a malach is lower than Atzilus.
That's what we're talking about now. We're talking about Biyah. Malachim are in Bria and Yitzira and Asiya. You have
Even
Srafim,
though that he is a
Chayes
shliach.
HaKadosh, and Efanim are the malachim of those worlds.
Even though that he's a shliach kemoisai.
I just said, but he's a separate entity. That's a shliach. In Atzilus, it's a merkava. You call it a complete seamless vehicle. Iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad. In Biyah, you won't say iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad. You'll say not a yesh mamish, not pirud mamish. Where did we find pirud mamish? Now he's entering the domain that we're all very familiar with. So let's read on. Listen to this. The Elam Asiya Gashmi. Now, when you go all the way down to the lowest world, the physical Elam Asiya, not Ruchni is the Elam Asiya, physical Elam Asiya, Nisav Dafke Be'efen Kazeh, was created specifically in this manner. Shelo Yurgish Afila Bechinas HaMetziyus Dalakus. They shouldn't even feel not only the Mehus, the Metziyus of Elikus. Yes, we can understand and we can believe and we can conclude and deduct that God created existence, but you don't just feel it. So you don't even feel the Metziyus of Elikus. V'yiu nifrodim imkeram. And they were created in a way that they should be separate, feel separate from their source. That we should not feel the source. In Biyah Ruchnim Ha'elyenim that he said, they feel the source, but they're a yesh that senses the source. Here, you don't even feel the source and the Metziyus of Elikus. Rak. Now comes the big qualification. Let me just see how long this parenthesis goes. Oh, okay, not that far. It's 3 lines, 4 lines. He's qualifying. It's only through our work and exertion and effort. Yasig v'yargish esa'er aleki. Through that work and effort, that even Nasiya Gashmi, you can comprehend and feel the divine light, the divine consciousness. And you can even feel in the nefesh through Aveda and Yegiya, also the air that's higher than existence. V'gam b'chinas Mehus ha'er. Eilemus here probably means Eilemus Biyah. And even the level of the very personality of air, but it's all through Aveda and Yegiya. V'hu inyan eilamcha tira b'chayecha. That's the concept when we say that he eilamcha, your world, your Eilam Haba, your higher world, you will see in your lifetime. It's the concept that a tzaddik and certain people reach in their Aveda that they can see Elam Haba, or in this case, he's talking about the higher worlds, even as that neshama is begufim below.
But not everyone.
Let me just finish 1 second. Well, it says here, but this is explicitly, specifically through effort, through work and exertion and effort. And even with Aveda, it's not like it's a must that a person will definitely come to that level. Which needs explanation what he means by that. Does it mean our b'chira and ratzon, or does it mean Hashem's b'chira and ratzon?
Exactly.
Because he says it can't. It's not a chrachis that muchrich b'zeh, but it comes with b'chira and ratzon. So in Tanya chapter 14, he says there, they quoted in the footnote that im yara alav ruach memorim, that the Eibishter can give in the neshama of a tzaddik into a beinani through his aveda, but it's a gift. It's not something that you for sure. So it could be that's what he's referring to. That through our Aveda Yigiyah, plus God's blessing, bestows upon the person these levels. That's what he means. But some have learned this Samach Vav, that it means B'chira v'ratzon also on the person, that the person works even harder. But it doesn't seem like that's pshat. This seems more like we have to definitely do Aveda Yigiyah. Without that, we're not even kalim for higher levels. But through Aveda and Yigiyah, we can reach it, and it's not but it's not an absolute must. It comes with b'chira v'ratzon. That's most likely the pshat, like I just said. That's Hashem's b'chira and ratzon. Let me just see the footnote. Yeah, Tanya Perik Yudalit. Right. I would want to look into it a little more to be able to say conclusively, but I think that's the pshat here. Now, why is the Rebbe Rashab adding that? Obvious reason. Because after everything we're learning, it comes away. You come away thinking, okay, you know what? We live in this world, we can never reach these higher levels. But that's not the case. Avedi V'giyah does reach these higher levels. Now, this is Elam Chatira B'chayecha today. La'asid Lave is a whole other story. La'asid Lave, we will be Zeicha to reach these levels. He doesn't talk about that here. Here he's talking about right now that we can reach, even in this world, you can reach levels that are higher than all the way to Mehus ha'or, which would mean essentially the levels of Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. Okay. So that now explains the difference between Atzilus, Biy. He's not gotten back to his original point, but the original point, let's not forget, was that the Ikar Yediyah and Asog and Ein Sof is in the higher worlds on their own, because there's no concealment. Down below, it's not there until we work at it. So we'll soon obviously tie this all together. I think, so I'll stop after the parentheses now. Any questions?
What does it mean? Gam b'chinas ha'oir shelemaylo me'ha'oilomes.
I just said higher than Elam is Biy, Atzilus.
It's probably what you said is the Perush, not b'chira v'rotzon of a person, because a Beinoni could not become a tzaddik, only like in Perek Yudalad, if Hashem is giving it to him.
Yeah, that's most likely the pshat, right?
He's also saying b'chira v'rotzon chulei. Maybe the chulei is a ibur of a neshama, another reason.
I don't know. Chuli by the Rebbe Rashab is very common, so I don't know how much you could read into it. But okay.
I would think that the
But
Bechira,
even Ibur comes with the Ratzon Hashem. It doesn't just happen and so.
I would think that the Bechira and Ratzon comes from the human being, because a lot of, let's say, Hasidim can learn Hasidus, but they don't have the intention and the Ratzon to connect to Hashem and the higher level.
But Pashas not what he means here. Because if you look he's most likely referring to chapter 14 in Tanya, where he talks about that.
It could be both.
Words, I just said that there is a second way to learn it. It just it's not likely the basic interpretation.
From my Pashtus viewpoint, that's I guess it's the difference between who's learning it. And then the other comment I had,
the difference between the rules of how you learn Chassidus and how much you can interpret things. So the most likely is referring to Tanya. We don't just and Tanya, that's what it says. Can you say it? Maybe, but then you'd have to be very difficult to explain. So why is it not mochruch by everybody? Why can't everybody have bechira and rotzen?
Because a lot of people walk through life,
Okay,
not
that's
really-
nice, but that could be for a farbring, and it may not be pshat and samach vav, is what I'm saying. So there's a point where you learn it, and you could talk about that, but I don't know if that's what he means here.
My other diuk is it's my first diuk. When the Rebbe Rashav says la'asid lavo, aren't we it? Aren't we the Rebbe Rashavs?
Where does he say loss of love?
Oh, maybe he doesn't say it. I just heard you say it.
I didn't. I said it. We're not talking about loss of love here. We're talking about elam chatir b'chayecha today. Loss of love is a whole other story. I said he's not discussing loss of love here. That will come later.
Fine, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Rabbi,
Yes.
before the rabbi mentioned the 30 kalim of Malchus of Atzilus. So, and it sounds pretty important to me. I never heard that idea before. Is the Rebbe Rashab going to teach us any more about that coming up?
It'll be mentioned later in Samach Vav. In Ayin Beis, we discussed it pretty much in detail at length. So I've given classes on it. You can look it up if you look it up through the AI, you probably can find it.
Okay. Was that early on in the Ayin Base or like later on?
Later in the volume 3.
Volume 3. Okay. Thanks, Rabbi.
Okay. So I think I'll stop here. Still not finished with these worlds. So there's going to be more coming about the worlds and back to Elam Haza, but he's going to get back to Begindish Tamudim Bay, how that cannot be the ultimate purpose. And we'll learn that in the next class or classes. I think here's a good place to stop. End of the parentheses, around 2/3 or around 2/3 of the way down, page 9. So I'm going to